With all that's going on in the world and in our personal lives, how do you find and follow the pleasure, the lightness, and through that to transform your life, your relationships, and your world? And how do you foster the emergence of healthy change that nurtures you and those around you? That conversation is what's in store in today's exciting episode. But first, I have a big announcement for you. On October 12th, 2019, John and Julie Gottman will be joining me here in Portland, Maine at the State Theater for Relationship Alive Live. So we'll have some deep conversation with the world's masters of relationship success, with a chance to have your questions answered then and there. There's reserved seating and tickets are going on sale today, July 23rd, 2019. So for more information and to buy tickets, please visit neilsattin.com/live show. That's LIVESHOW. And I am excited to see you there. And we're still working out who the musical guest is going to be, but I guarantee you it's going to be someone fun and really entertaining. Okay, just a reminder that Relationship Alive is my offering to you so that you can have the most successful relationships possible. If you are finding the show to be helpful, please consider a donation to help ensure that we can continue with our mission. To choose something that feels right to you, and remember, any little bit counts and helps, just visit neilsattin.com/support or text the word support to the number 33444 and follow the instructions. And this week, I would like to thank Jordan, Kent, Alana, Sarah, Deb, Mira, Joseph, Ruthanna, and Karen. Thank you all so much for your generous support of Relationship Alive. Also, just a reminder that I have a free guide for you called My Top 3 Relationship Communication Secrets. These are communication tips that are exclusive to relational communication, so communicating with your loved ones in a way that keeps you connected no matter how challenging the thing is that you are talking about. To download this free guide, all you have to do is visit neilsattin.com/relate, or you can text the word relate to the number 33444 and follow the instructions. And I am just about to release the beta version of my Secrets of Relationship Communication course. If you want to find out when the course is out, and my goal with this course is to have it be something that transforms your communication with your partner, and it doesn't require them to do anything. So I've specifically targeted all the ways that you can change the only person in the relationship that you can actually change, which is you, to create and evoke better communication with your partner. So that's my Secrets of Relationship Communication course, which is almost ready. And if you want to find out when it is fully released, just sign up for the free guide and then I'll let you know. So again, neilsattin.com/relate or text the word relate to the number 33444 and follow the instructions. If you didn't catch last week's episode, it was all about what to do in your relationship when things get really challenging, and also what not to do. So I highlight some of the losing strategies as well as some of the strategies that are most likely to result in success for you. So check out last week's episode, and just wanted to remind you that I'm going to start taking the last week of the month off. So that will be a chance for you to catch up on episodes you haven't heard yet, or catch up with your loved ones or your friends, or something else entirely. But that is going to be a day for me to catch up with my life, with episodes, with some of the new projects that are coming out. And yeah, so that's how things are shifting. So next week, you'll have a little bit more time to yourself to do whatever you want to do. One of those things might be joining us in the Relationship Alive community on Facebook, which is a way for you to meet other people who listen to the podcast, and it's a place to get support in your relationship or with your relationship stuff. We're trying to keep it a really safe space for people to be vulnerable and courageous and ask good questions. So that is the Relationship Alive community on Facebook. And finally, before we get going, I just want to remind you that if you have a question that you'd like me to answer, record it on your phone and email it to me at questions@relationshipalive.com. And I will keep you anonymous, but I will answer your question live on the show. So I'm excited for the questions that are coming in, and maybe it could be yours that we answer on the next Q&A show. All right, I think that's it. Let us get on with the show. Hello and welcome to the 200th episode of Relationship Alive. This is your host, Neil Satin. I want to start by saying that I believe in the power of synchronicity. I believe that when synchronicities happen, it means something. And so to me, it meant a lot when I was walking into a bookstore with a new friend of mine in New York City, and she grabbed this book off the shelf and she said, given what we've just been talking about, how you want to make this huge impact with your work and with the Relationship Alive podcast, you need to read this book. And she handed me a book called Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And after reading that book and being so moved by what I read there, both in terms of the promise that it holds for how our lives can unfold in a way that's really organic and natural and suited to who we are as people, and also how that can impact the communities that we form, whether it be our micro communities, our family, our friends, or our larger communities, the movements that we become a part of, and how we create change in this world. It was just super inspiring to me. And I was delighted to see that Adrienne was coming out with a new book called Pleasure Activism, which just hit the New York Times bestseller list. And I thought, you know what, like, I have to talk to this person, and hopefully they'll talk to me. So, I reached out, and fortunately here we are today to talk to Adrienne Maree Brown, who is a social justice facilitator focused on Black liberation, a doula, healer, and a pleasure activist, and a coach. And the list goes on. And honestly, I can relate, and I love that about her work. And so we're going to be here to talk about emergence and pleasure and how this all unfolds in the world of relationship, the relationship you have to yourself, the relationship you have to your beloved or beloveds, and the relationship you have with the world. As usual, we will have a detailed transcript of today's episode, which you can get if you visit neilsatin.com/AMB, as in Adrienne Maree Brown. Or you can always text the word passion to the number 33444 and follow the instructions, and that will get you the transcript and the show notes and all that good stuff. I think that's it. So Adrienne, thank you so much for being here with us today on Relationship Alive.
Thanks for having me, Neil. I'm excited that a podcast that's about relationships in this way exists. So I'm like, yay, let's talk about it.
Awesome. Yeah. I've been thinking about a good way to dive in without asking you like a ridiculously broad question. But I might have to start with a ridiculously broad question.
You're like, I tried. I can't. It's okay.
Well,
what's the ridiculously broad question?
Yeah. So let's start with this idea about pleasure and activism. And what does it mean to have pleasure be the center of how one operates in the world?
For me, I got this terminology was taught to me. I learned the words from an organizer named Keith Kyler, who was the founder of something called Housing Works that's based in New York that raises resources and all kinds of resources, like financial resources, but also does trainings and other things like that for people who are dealing with houselessness, dealing with HIV/AIDS. And I was really moved by his genius and his work. But one time we were just sitting around having a good time, and he talked to me about this terminology, pleasure activism. And it stuck with me over the years. Like I kept being like, oh, like, what could that mean? What could that mean? What could that mean? And especially as I grew, I've always been very aware that there's a lot in the world that is broken, that is hurting, that is traumatized. And inside of that, reaching for how are we meant to connect with each other? And somewhere in there, this idea of pleasure activism kept returning to me as I was doing voter organizing, returning to me as I was learning about harm reduction, returning to me as I was supporting people to do direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience. It just kept coming back. And when I was working on my last book, Emergent Strategy, I had to include it as a concept. And I wasn't sure at that point, like, am I going to flesh this all the way out? Like, there's a lot here. But then at some point I was like, let me just, like, what would it look like? What would it look like to actually flesh this out? And I had been reading Audre Lorde's text, The Uses of the Erotic as Power, which I got permission to reprint in this book. And I really loved her use of the erotic. And yet I just kept coming back to this idea of pleasure, like that pleasure includes the erotic, but also includes a lot of things that may or may not be erotic. And so I was like, what is pleasure? And I looked it up and it was just like happy, joy, and satisfaction. And I was like, gosh, it seems so simple. And yet there's so much resistance to it. There's so much fear of it. There's so much control of it. And for those of us who are like actively trying to change the world in some way, there's a denial of it, right? Like, it's like, we are not allowed to have that. We need to be fighting for this, future that's off in the future somewhere.
Right.
And I just remember landing in like, wouldn't it be so radical to listen to what Audre Lorde had taught us about engaging the erotic now, engaging our full aliveness in this moment. And for Black women who, that's who was at the front of my mind when I wrote this text, I was like, there's a lot that has intentionally cut us off from our relationship with joy and happiness and pleasure and contentment and satisfaction. It's been trained into us that we're not allowed to have those things. So I got very like lit up with this idea that I was like, oh, what if we could have these things? Like, what if it's a measure of our freedom to reclaim pleasure? And so that kind of sent me off down this path that has been really exciting. And, it's interesting because activism in general is not where I land, right? Like I've often been like, I'm an organizer. And for me, the distinction, I think activists are folks who are really like advocating for something, like using their public sphere to advocate for something, going and talking to friends. Organizers to me are folks who are like, I'm actually trying to move a strategy amongst the people, right? Like I'm going to go find those who are not going to just easily be reached, and I'm going to knock on their doors, and I'm going to find out what they need and build an analysis and a vision together. And so, I was like, okay, is activism okay for this? And it felt like actually for this, it is. It is important that as many people in the world as possible begin to come out and advocate for all of our rights to have pleasure, and to have pleasure be an organizing principle of how we structure our relationships in our society. And that it starts with reclaiming our own and moves out from that place. So I'm excited that it exists. I'm excited that it came together. And then I've been really blown away by the responses. So I'm like, okay, I really for a while was like, this is not the right book to be putting out right now. We need something about justice, or we need something about like, I kept having this strategic idea around if this current administration is starting fires all over the place, I kept thinking like, how do we conjure up water? How do we vaporize ourselves in some way to come up and over and rain down on them? And I was like, I need to go write that strategy book or whatever. And then I realized, I was like, oh, this is actually it.
This is that book, right? Yeah.
This is actually that book. And that's been clicking to me that I'm like, this is it. This is the way that we become more powerful through pleasure, through what we can release rather than what we can contain. So
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love it. I love it. It's, to me, there's so many threads that came together for me as I was reading the book, and even just in hearing you speak right now. Primarily that way that many people, I should say, are so exhausted right now with just the state of affairs. And
That's right.
and that's political, it's environmental, it's economic. There's a lot that's taxing us. And there's something that regenerates us when we can find the sources of pleasure within us and in how we connect with the world.
That's
that
right.
I think allows us to bring more of ourselves to the world, and also highlights the places where we are denying ourselves or denying others that inalienable right for the experience of joy.
That's right. I mean, it blows my mind to really think about like what people have survived. Like often when I stand in a room of people and I'm giving a speech or talk or a training or something, there's, a lot of me that's present with that moment. But then there's also a part of me that's kind of thinking about all the lineages of all these human beings and how some of them in this moment have landed in a place of power or privilege, and some of them have ended up in a place that's not that. But that those lineages all include some survival, some fighting to exist, some taking a risk, some, moving out into the world with an unknown response. Like we don't know what's going to happen here. We don't know if we're heading the right way. We don't know if we're going to survive. And that there have been so many things that have, like so much of our human history has just been about surviving, right? Just like, can we make it? And so there's something interesting to me now to be like, I think we have shown that like, oh, we could make it. Like we could figure this out. We could be on this planet technically, but what is the life worth making it for? Like what is worth surviving for?
Yeah.
And now I think we're actively in that question, that it's like all of us deserve this relationship to pleasure. And when you look at like who thinks they deserve it or who is encouraged to have it, it's actually a very narrow, small grouping of human beings. And I think that's because of capitalism. I really think that as an economic system, capitalism thrives when we believe that we are not good enough and that we need to buy something outside of ourselves in order to experience pleasure. And I love the trick of it, which is like if you actually just drop down into your own body, which is the only thing in your entire life that you ever truly have, from the beginning to the end. If you just drop down into it, it's wired for pleasure. And those wires may have been crossed. There may be some like dysfunctional parts of it because of trauma, because of pain, because of, which I now also, when I meet everyone, I'm like, I know you have some trauma, right?
Yeah.
Like
No
I
one
know you have
escapes that.
some. Yeah. I don't know what it is. I don't know how severe or central it is to your life or your life story. I don't know if you had the resources to recover or not, but I know it's there. And so I think like, oh, what we're dealing with is like, what is the relationship between that trauma that's everywhere and this system that's telling us that we can't heal ourselves. We shouldn't even feel ourselves. We should just kind of outsource that to something we can purchase. And then how in that do we find a way to be in right relationship with each other or this planet? Right. So that's the stuff I keep floating around with. Is like, I want to leave a world behind me that people are like, I feel very compelled. I want to be here. It feels good. Right. And that doesn't mean that I think we will solve the climate crisis in my lifetime. Because I do think, I really believe in Gopal Dayanini, who works over at Movement Generation and talks about like there's things that we have already set in motion that we are going to have to face the consequences of as a species. And I don't deny that that's what's coming to us. But inside of that, I think we also have to be actively fomenting pleasure and actively fomenting like reconnecting ourselves to land and to each other. Because as the changes happen, we're still going to need to be able to feel pleasure, feel satisfaction, feel like being here. Otherwise, we'll just depress and numb and, kind of slip away. And I think that would be an unworthy end to our species.
Totally agree with you. And a word that popped into my mind that I would like to add to that is resilience.
Yeah.
That the more that we're embracing our capacity for resilience in terms of how we heal our lineage of trauma or present moment traumas, in terms of how we make things right when they've gone wrong. And do that in the context where what we're shooting for, what we're envisioning is something joyful, blissful, like that actually has ease and pleasure connected to it. Yes. Then that makes it worth it and gives us kind of I hate to use the word technology, but like a technology of continually adjusting to get there. You talk in Emergent Strategy about adaptability.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I was like, like to me, emergent strategy and pleasure activism really go together. Like they're holding hands, dancing across the field of ideas. And I really think that this idea of resilience, I have a teacher, Alta Starr, who's always pushing me to be like, resilience is beyond even harm, right? It's sort of like this natural capacity we have to adapt, to like grow, to learn from whatever changes come. And it's hard for me because I'm still like, well, but also when someone hurts us, that's when, we have to be resilient. And, it's hard in a city like Detroit because, resilience can be weaponized. Like if people are like, well, you bounce back from anything, like we'll just keep doing anything to you. Like, we'll add an incinerator to your neighborhood or whatever, you'll be fine. And so I think there's something about, to me, like, how do we have a transformative resilience, right? How do we have resilience that is not just like we can recover back to conditions that we weren't very happy with in the first place, and being like, when I look at like, what am I recovering? I'm recovering something that's beyond my own origin, like I need to recover something that goes back past the many hours that my grandmother overworked. And I need to recover something that goes back past my enslaved ancestors and recover something that goes back past my kidnapped ancestors and, ancestors. Like I feel this long arc of the work that I'm in right now, where I'm like, almost everyone that came before me was trying to work towards some joy, some freedom, some sense of safety for their children and themselves. And now I am awakened. So like I'm aware of all of that, and I have an option in front of me to be resilient across time and space, right? And that feels very exciting. I think as hard as it is to live in this age of like hyper connectedness, because I think it is really hard. My friend Angel Kyoto Williams talks about this, that like we are given access to so much more information than we've ever had access to before, but we're not given the tools to handle it all, right? Like we're not taught, here's how to meditate, here's how to pass what's overwhelming back to the earth or back to God or back to whomever you trust with it. Like we're not given those technologies, right? So we're kind of flailing a lot of the time of like, I'm receiving all this, I'm trying to care about all of it, and we find ourselves stretched so far. But I also think the really beautiful thing about that is like, we can see how many people believe what we believe, how many people are trying to practice what we're trying to practice, and we can find each other. You and I would have never found each other if it wasn't for this modern state of connection.
Right.
And to be able to say like, oh, you're out here in Maine fomenting these ideas, and I'm out here in Detroit fomenting these ideas, and we have very different lineages, and yet we both have arrived in this place where it's like, this is a path, this is a way to move forward. It's important. Paying attention to relationship is important. And so that, that gives me hope inside of the struggle of this overwhelming moment where there is so much that is hard. It's also, there's so much that is overwhelmingly beautiful and overwhelmingly good. And there's so many ways that, also we live on such a resilient planet. So I often think about this, that I'm like, and I feel like I'm trying to remember whoever first said this idea to me, because I was like, oh, snap, that's like a game changer. It's like the earth is going to be okay.
Yeah.
Right? Like the earth is going to be okay. Like she might go through an ice age or something, but like if we're not here, she'll still be okay. And like, if we're not here, she'll recover from whatever we've done, like how we've remixed her nature into other kinds of things. And I don't know if you saw the story came out last week about the white-throated rail. Did you see that?
I hadn't, but I saw you wrote about it on your blog. Yeah.
I was so moved by this. So this like little bird, basically this bird re-evolved, right? Like it went extinct 136,000 years ago, roughly, because like, you know, these things are hard to track, but like now this bird has re-evolved, has come back into existence. The same little, it's a flightless bird. There's something about that just, I read it and I really was like moved in a way. I was like, I didn't know I needed to know that was possible. But I was like, I need to know that level of resilience is possible. Like somewhere down in the programming of this planet, there's some code that's just like white-throated rail. And just because we can no longer see the creature doesn't mean that it's disappeared. Like there's some aspect of it, of that DNA, that's in there. And yeah, it made me feel like, okay, like there's mysteries on mysteries on mysteries when it comes to this planet. And there's so much that we can't understand. And so inside of that, I'm like, you know, I love thinking really big, grandiose thoughts, but then I try to bring them back down into very small, tangible practices, small ways of being with each other. Because I'm like, I can't imagine how we'll get through the climate catastrophe that we're in right now, but I can imagine being in right relationship with the planet around me and making better choices about this local place that I'm in and being place-based and loving, even though I travel a lot, but I'm like rooting myself into the soil in Detroit in all the ways that I can. Like, this is where I bury my compost. This is where I play with children. This is where I, you know, go find like, where's the Detroit grown foods every summer. And I'm really cautious now. I've made a major shift in my life around how I produce waste, like what kind of waste I, you know, will put out, so that I've tried to really shrink down my garbage waste, like to the very, very, you know, it's like if I can rinse it and I can clean it off and it can be recycled, it's going to be recycled. If it's food, if it can go into compost, it goes into compost. And like I used to have a massive garbage bin that I was putting out. And I'm like, I live alone, you know, all of that was stuff that like other things could be done with. And now it's like, you know, a huge portion of what comes out of my home is going to be recycled and reused again. And I'm aiming at zero waste. I'm constantly trying to figure out like where are other places where I just bought this new set of like Ziplocs, reusable kind of Ziploc thingies so they're, you know, cause I'm a fan of Ziploc bags. Like, I'm like, you can put anything in a Ziploc bag. You can go anywhere. If you have I carry like in my suitcase, there's always like 5 Ziploc bags, just like folded just in case. Cause you just never know what you're going to need a Ziploc bag for. And so I'm like, oh, that's a next frontier that I need to like, you know, figure out a way to advance through and like, oh, I can do this. Right. So anyway, all of that to say, to me, I'm trying in my personal life to get in right relationship with nature, and my body is a huge part of that. Like, if I'm not in right relationship and respecting the miraculous, like stardust nature of my body, then how can I even begin to be in right relationship with the rest of the living world?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Adrienne, I have to just take a quick break to talk about this week's sponsors. Our first sponsor for today has a special offer for you to help you get exactly the kind of support that you need as you're creating the web of support that we often talk about here on the show. And one way that allows you to connect with a professional counselor in an online environment that's safe and private is today's sponsor, BetterHelp. With BetterHelp, you can get help on your own time and at your own pace. Along with scheduling video or phone sessions, you can also chat and text with your therapist. They're affordable, and financial aid is available for those who qualify. So whether it's anxiety, depression, your relationship, stress, grief, dealing with trauma, finding the pleasure in your life, whatever it is, definitely consider BetterHelp as a way to help transform your stuck places. And best of all, it is a truly affordable option because as a Relationship Alive listener, you get 10% off your first month with a discount code ALIVE. So why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/alive. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs and get matched with a counselor that you'll love. And if you don't like your counselor, you can always switch if you need to. That's betterhelp.com/alive. And thank you, BetterHelp, for being a sponsor of today's show. Our second sponsor for today is Nourishes, and they have a special offer for you as a Relationship Alive listener on their exquisite jewelry. Their pieces are made to last a lifetime. They're perfect for today and as an heirloom that your family will treasure far into the future. Nourishes is handcrafted in the finest materials, reclaimed 18-karat gold, conflict-free stones, and lab-grown diamonds, and it's all priced as fairly as possible because they cut out the middleman. Also, they ship to you overnight for free so that you can try it on and have up to 60 days to return for free with a full refund. So trying something from their site to see how it feels and looks on you is completely risk-free. And as I mentioned, they have a special offer for you. Head to hellonourishes.com. That's the word hello, followed by NOEMIE.com, and use the coupon code ALIVE for $75 off your order today. And if you want this as a gift from someone, don't make them guess. Just go ahead and tell them what you want with Nourishes' Drop a Hint option, which is on every product page. That's $75 off with the coupon code ALIVE at hellonourishes.com. And thank you so much, Nourishes, as well, for your support of Relationship Alive. And now let's get back to our conversation with Adrienne Maree Brown. So first, I'm so moved when I hear you talk about not really being able to read the code, but seeing the expressions of the code, like the bird coming back into existence from extinction. And even when you were describing how you and I could be doing different work in different places, and yet here we find ourselves together having this conversation.
Yeah.
To me, that is an expression of the power of something that's ineffable, that like we can't understand, but if we're willing to follow that path and follow the ways that it's growing and things are emerging, then at least that inspires hope in me that there's like an antidote to disconnection, to destruction, to you know, all the forces that we're working against. And in terms of relationship, the ways that people are experience this desire for closeness and connection, you know, part of our wiring, as you were mentioning earlier, is to be connected to each other. That's right. Yet it becomes such a source of pain, partly because we either intentionally or unintentionally traumatize each other, and then also because of the social structures and their impact on us. When you talk about pleasure and relearning pleasure, getting in touch with your body, and I like that stand that you take for the personal being political, that fractal nature of transformation. I think about how many of us are just kind of following the script of romance and love and sex and pleasure and needing.
When did you become aware that there was a script?
Well, it's been an unfolding for me for sure. And I think probably I became most aware of it when I inadvertently hurt someone and like had no idea that was happening for them, and found out later. And then, you know, thankfully we've had our moments of amends and talking and all of that, but restoring ourselves. But that was probably the inception of it. And then all through college. And then in my current relationship, I'm so blessed to be with someone who's taken a strong stand for her own boundaries around her own healing, her own trauma. And it forced me to go even deeper into like, well, what am I looking for in relationship? Right. What am I looking for in sex? What is this rejection, quote unquote, that I'm experiencing in this moment? And what is that really about? And And so that has forced me to ask deeper questions and to get progressively more and more honest with myself and with her, to a point where fairly recently I feel like I've hit ground zero. But it's a process. It's definitely been an unfolding and watching those layers fall away. And then once they do, being like, all right, well, how do I replace this? If I'm not going to do sex the way that I thought I should, or, I think it was an essay that you wrote where you mentioned a babysitter who was watching Porky's when you were a kid. Yeah.
Yes.
And the way those things inform our sense of what's erotic, what turns us on, all of that. Once I peel those things away and come back to this moment and what's real, well, that's what my journey has been like. And I've certainly tried to surface that a bunch here on the podcast, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about that unfolding for yourself. And you mentioned meditation earlier. What are the pathways in to kind of breaking down the unhealthy learnings and coming back into right relationship with ourselves as relational, sexual, erotic, pleasure-oriented beings.
Right? I feel like a couple of things. I mean, I think one is there was a period of time where I was really convinced that sex didn't have anything to do with me or what I was feeling. Like, it was really like, what is the other person feeling? And like, that's what's important right now. And like, my job is to make sure that experience is a whole good one. Right. And I feel like I remember, like, there's these moments, and most of it's relational, right? Like, most of it is like just other people reflecting something back that's like, bro, it doesn't have to be like that. People talking to me, reading stuff. I remember reading the work of Andrea Dworkin. Have you read her? Like, she talks pretty scathingly about marriage and pornography, and like a lot of the things that I was just like took for granted were like, those are good things that you try to get to in life. And I don't agree with everything. I feel like there's a lot of brilliant thinking in what she said, and I feel like there's also not a lot offered of like, here are the true pleasures, like, here's the ways to get them. But there was something that blew open for me where I was just like, I want to be able to consider this. I want to be able to consider that everything I was told about where pleasure in my life would come from, or was and wasn't allowed, that maybe all of that is wrong. Right. And then Audre Lorde's writing, Octavia Butler's writing, there were just all these different people who were giving me, it was never just about sex. It was never just about the body. It was always, have a revolution about how you think about how things work in the world. Start to ask questions and get curious about who benefits from these systems, right? So I remember having a conversation with a friend about marriage, and just being like, who benefits in marriage, right? And being pretty like, oh my gosh, no one should ever get married. Like, I was like, no woman should ever get married. Like, I felt very strongly. I was like, nope, it's just not a good idea. Like, you will work forever in a labor that will never, ever get acknowledged. You will not be able to pursue passion work, things that you actually care about. You will not be respected in the process. And then, and then he'll cheat on you. Like, this is the arc of it, right? Because, he'll need something younger and prettier, and he's worked you out, right? And I remember having that conversation. He's like, no, and then be like, well, no, that's just one way. That's a model that is the system that benefits from that is patriarchy. And if I can understand that, then I can be like, let me target patriarchy. I'm very lucky that I came across the work of Grace Lee Boggs, where she really is like, transform yourself to transform the world. And this is something I say probably every day of my life. There's some place or some way in which I say this to someone else or to myself. But so I was like, oh, where is patriarchy in my own practice? Where is patriarchy showing up in how I'm approaching a relationship? And some of the interesting places were how quickly I would be dishonest for the sake of connection. And I say connection in quotation marks there, right? That I was like, well, I don't want to be alone. And like, being alone is a sign of someone who's not a good person or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to be like with someone to be like a part of the human experiment or whatever. First, that is, I no longer believe that, but like, but at the time I was just like, okay, I don't want to be alone. So I would go out on a date or someone, I feel like I came up like right at the end of dating also.
Uh-huh.
So it's like right at the end of like when you would actually say, let's go on a date to a place and get to know each other for maybe 3 or 4 times. We would do that before we were actually alone in either of our places. And, something else would happen, right? I'm like, I come from what feels like almost a chaste time before the apps kind of popped off and it was just like your place or mine, like what's good, And I talk about the apps as if I know what I'm talking about. I've never really used the apps that's just not how I meet people, but I know that the majority of people in my life, that's now how people connect. But so you go out and you're having these initial conversations, and my practice was to just kind of listen for what I thought the other person really wanted to hear and then deliver that somehow. And, I grew up as a military brat. I moved like roughly every 2 years. So you get really good at figuring out like, what are the rules here?
Yeah.
And how do I adapt to be safe within them? And it can be hard when you get good at that to also be like, and then what is fundamental to me? Like, what is the me that I'm also carrying to each place that needs to adapt? And the same thing in dating. Like, what is the me that's showing up and like might adapt in some relationship, but like, why am I rushing to not just adapt, but like completely contort into something? Why am I so desperate for being in relationship that I won't even be there? Right? Like, it won't even be me that shows up.
Yeah.
So I feel like I had rounds and rounds of that. And it never worked. I kept having this heartbreak that was really almost never about the other person, but it was about facing how much I had contorted to get in the door and then how little I actually wanted to be inside that house, right?
Yeah,
Whatever house it was. And so I feel like I took,
which by the way is a super common problem that people have.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
When I do a bunch of, like you said, coaching and mediation and stuff like that. And I find like that is the number one thing. That's the number one thing is that people are like, you're just not who you said you were.
Right.
And how could you not be who you said you were? And how could you not uphold the promises that you made? And it's just like, I was lying. I wasn't even there. Like, I don't even know. I'm sorry,
Right. And then there's that additional layer of, oh, wait a minute. Now we also have to deal with your shame around who you are, around your truth. And
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's the shame and the still absence of yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So often now I've been doing a lot of support for people who are in their, mid 30s to 50s. And a lot of the folks I'm supporting are going through major breakups of fundamental relationships. And it's interesting because they're like, who am I? Like, who am I? Like so much was defined in relationship to this other person. Yeah. And that's how so many people get trained to become themselves. It's like, now I'm half of something, and now that's who I am. And so much of the work is being like, you're a whole something. You are a whole something. And I think the thing I'm always watching out for is not to send people all the way to the other side of the pendulum, right? To me, the personal is political only as it relates to being part of a collective effort to be political about what is personal, right? Uh-huh. So I feel like this is, someone was asking me, I did an interview yesterday and they're like, what about the goop? What about the like white women taking baths or whatever? And I was just like, yeah, like, that so much of self-care is about that. It's like white people with privilege go off to the spa. Mm-hmm. And that's when, often when I mention to people, they're like, I'm not about all that, and I'm just like, yeah, I don't think that that's political necessarily either. Right. I think it becomes political in relationship to your identity. I think it becomes political in relationship to the community you're a part of and how you're making sure that everyone has access to the beautiful, good parts of life, right? And so, I'm part of a community. I'm part of many communities, but there's a particular community I call the Goddesses, and it's a bunch of women. We all went to school together, and now everyone's like slaying dragons in all these different fields of life. And we have started to really like have each other's backs and hold each other down in a way that like we didn't know how to necessarily do back then. Right. Mm-hmm. But we've like rediscovered each other and been like, we need to like all, like about half of the people are moms. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, we need to go places where like everyone here gets to relax and be taken care of, that we get to be part of something that's close knit and intimate, but that we get to have massages, or we get to be in a hot tub, or we get to, just cook for each other, or take each other out to the best places we can find to eat, or like, there's so many small pleasures that feel really important. Like, it wouldn't be great for me if I was just like, I'm over here living my best life and all my sisters are out here struggling. Like, I don't think that that's a way towards freedom, right? For me, it's very important that as I have access, I increase access for everyone else.
Yeah.
And I particularly increase access for those who have less access than me. Like, that to me is part of the political commitment I'm in for my lifetime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just thinking here about the commodification of self-care, and I think that's part of what you're talking about, right? Is that like,
yes,
you actually
Capitalism.
don't. Yeah, exactly. There it is again. It's
always there. Yeah.
One thing that popped up for me when you were talking about structures and like, I would never get married, and and then and then that sense of like, well, okay, it's just a system, and who does it benefit?
Yeah.
And maybe there's a time and a place. What popped up for me was this question around the dance between safety. And I think it was because you mentioned, when going out on a date, like, part of what's happening there is deciding, am I safe with this person?
Exactly.
And then that, because safety is right up there with connection in terms of something that we require in order to function as humans.
That's right.
So, and that's interesting as you start pulling apart the structures, because one thing that marriage can be really good at is supporting safety. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so how do you start to loosen those tethers in a way that still supports people being held? Because if you're not feeling safe, you're not growing in a way that's probably generative for you. You're just like scrambling back to safety for the most part.
I think I love this question. I think this is this is an essential one to me. It's like, okay, how do we balance these things? And a couple of thoughts leap to mind. One is that I think people feel like they have to choose between safety and like being their whole selves, or being in their dignity, like all of it. And that first part, that feels like it's not true, right? I'm like, that's part of the lie that we've been told, is that you have to choose. Yeah. And so you can either be safe in a marriage where you don't get to be fully realized as yourself, or you can be fully realized as yourself, but like, without that stability. And I've seen the case more often than not be that you find that deep safety within yourself. It's a feeling, not a story that you're telling about your life, right? Or a projection you're giving for someone else, but it's actually like a felt sense. Like, I feel it in my life. Most of my life now, I feel safe, right? And I can feel when that changes. Like, sometimes I'll be in a space where there's just too many people, too much energy, something's off, and I can feel it. And it heightens my senses. It heightens my awareness. It makes me pay attention to what's happening around me. But then I think something like marriage, that kind of commitment, what I see so often happening is that people get into it and then they're like, this isn't the safety that I thought it was going to be, right? Maybe it is for the first month or the first year, or even until the first child or whatever, but like, then there's some moment where that falls away, because what you thought you had was like, I know you and you know me. And what's really happening is you're changing and I'm also changing. And so I've officiated a few weddings. And one of the things that's been exciting is that the people who ask me to officiate are like, we want to commit to changing together, right? That to me is the kind of commitment that I can get behind, where people are like, I know this person's going to change. I know I'm going to change, but I'm so curious about who they are and who they will become. And I want to be there for that ride. And so it's not about marriage as entrapment, like catching you into one single identity, or any relationship, right? Because now I'm like, you don't have to get married to be trying to trap someone in your web. And I really like the model, which I'm sure you've heard of relationship anarchy. I don't think anything is like a perfect thing, but I really like it because so much of it is like, safety. What I think you were talking about with safety, to me, so much of that is rooted in trust, right? It's like, oh, I trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. And I trust that I can tell you my truth or whatever it is. And in relationship anarchy, which I think is like someone in Sweden, Andy Andy Norgan or something like that. I have to I have to go look at her name, but you can look up at like a relationship anarchy manifesto, right? And I love it because it's like trust is something that we build together over time. And like we start out with a default of trust, like rather than starting out with a default of like, you've got it, like your trust is at 0 and you have to like somehow bring it up to 100 and never let yourself, like never fuck up, like never ever break my trust in any way, or I'm going to hold that against you for the rest of time. And I'm like, instead you start from a place of like, I have an abundant sense of trust for like my place in the world, for what I'm up to in the world, for like the work that I'm here to do, my purpose. And then I meet you and I'm just going to offer you trust as a human being. And what I am counting on is that if you break my trust, then we'll figure out how to recover together. Right. And sometimes that breaking of trust might be, we're not supposed to recover together, or sometimes the breaking of trust will expose something like you're more committed to, like I see this happen sometimes where people are like in an open relationship, but still do cheating type behaviors. Right. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, great. That's good information, right? Like you're still very committed to a certain kind of secrecy. Maybe that's what turns you on as the forbidden, something along those lines. And that's not compatible, right? With the kind of relationship that I'm trying to build or whatever, the kind of relationship this person's trying to build. And so I get really excited about stuff like that because I'm like, then then it's like we just got clear about it. And like we can trust each other to take the step back and transition to some other form of relationship versus I think what happens now, which is like I offered you a false trust that you could never live up to, that I was waiting for you to somehow live up to. You broke it. And now I never want to see your face again. Right. Like you let me down so thoroughly that I don't even want you to exist. And I'm like, I don't think we have enough people for that way of being with each other, right? That we can just keep being like, if you're not perfectly trustworthy, then I kick you out of my community forever. And I say that, the same thing you said, it's like you learned some of this from causing harm. Like, I learned from breaking people's trust, right?
Yeah.
Like there are people who I love and care about, and I broke their trust. And I've had to do like a lot of work, around like, am I a trustworthy person? If the answer is no, how would I become a trustworthy person, right? And again, so much of that initial line of inquiry was just like about other people. Like, how can I let them know? How can I show? How can I prove that I'm trustworthy? And of course, the answer is like, I have to be trustworthy. Like, I have to be able to feel in myself. And I'll tell a little example of this.
Sure.
I was in the airport like last week, and I was running through, and a lot had been happening. And I went and sat down on a bench. And there was this coat next to me. And I asked around like, hey, anybody, is this your coat? And everybody was like, no, whoever this coat is, they just left this coat here. There's no bag. There's nothing else around it. So I let it sit there for a little while. And I'm like, that's a nice coat, right? It's a nice coat. And so I picked it up to look at it. And it's like a designer coat. And it happens to be my size, right? So I'm like, this is a very nice, gorgeous designer coat that someone just left here on this bench. And like, who knows if they're ever going to make it back, right? But that, part of my brain was like, a gift from the universe. And I was like, and I picked it up and I like looked at it and I was like, that would not be a trustworthy behavior to just take this coat and move on with life, right? Like, there's a chance that that person is still in this airport and that they're like running back here to get their very expensive, nice coat, right? Right, they'll call Delta like, do you know where my coat is or whatever it is? Mm-hmm. And so I took it over to the, I don't know, where they check you in for the plane. I took it over to one of the guys there and I was like, this was left over there. And they're like, oh my goodness, like, that's so sweet, and it was just like, I felt the burden lift off my system. Yeah. That I'm like, oh, I was about to really just take someone's coat. Right. Yeah. But I didn't. And it's a small thing. Like, it's a really small thing that like no one would have known if I had done the wrong thing.
Except you.
But I would have known.
Yeah.
And like trying to get to that place in my life where like I don't make the mistake because it would hurt my integrity and my wholeness and my dignity outside of anyone else's. And even if I know it, that creates a shadow. Like, how do I turn to my lover and tell that story? How do I walk into a room where I'm offering people like, let's be trustworthy people, and I'm standing there in a coat that I stole from some poor stranger, right? So to me, it's that. It's like, is my relationship with myself intact? And then from that place, can I be in contact with another person and say, now this is intact? And if it gets harmed, I commit to helping us get to intactness. And sometimes that looks like a boundary. I keep repeating these words. My friend Princess Hemphill had this thought last week and then spread it all over the world, basically. But it's boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Mm. And I keep thinking about that I'm like, that. Sometimes, right? Isn't it beautiful?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's like that. It's like sometimes intactness is at a great distance, right? It's like, we're good. As long as you're 2,000 miles away from me, we're fine, right? It's good. Like, don't cross that boundary and it's all good.
Right.
And so I think about that. I'm like, that's one of the things I talk about in pleasure activism is like, our no makes the way for our yes. Like the good boundaries are actually so crucial for the good relationships.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What seems contained too in what you're offering is the necessity for healing, like to recognize like, okay, if we're not in right relationship, we're all each on a healing journey to getting there. It's probably rare, the person who's reached their 30s or 40s or more, and hasn't experienced some sort of disruption of their integrity.
That's right.
So there's the healing component. There's also the compassion component. Like, if I expect you to be perfect and you fail me, and then that becomes this huge breach, then that's a much different problem than I'm trusting you and I'm also wanting you. Like I'm willing to be okay with where you and I aren't perfect as long as we can be in full disclosure about that together.
That's right.
That's the honesty piece.
I like that. I feel like that's, because I also think about this, like for people who are like, oh no, I'm sure there's someone, not me, I'm good. Like I don't know what she's talking about. I don't lie to myself or whatever. I'm like, so often the people who seem to who have it all together are in some ways damaging themselves the most. Like, I feel like now I have stopped doing to myself the harm of trying to pretend I am perfect. Right.
Yeah.
And I see it. I mean, I feel like that, when people watch Beyonce's Homecoming, right? It was like, what was intriguing to me is that she was like, I was pushing for perfection and it meant having to like learn all this stuff, but I would never do this again. It wasn't perfect. It was actually too much. I harmed myself. But I pulled this off, but I harmed myself in doing it. Like, there's even stuff like that, right? Where I'm like, what are you denying of yourself? That's where you're creating a prison, right? Yeah. For yourself. You're containing that part of you that wants to be alive and free and moving around. And I'll say I'm part of the generative somatics teaching body. And for me, somatics has been the healing pathway that has like opened so much. And there's a really beautiful episode of the Healing Justice podcast that has a woman named Sumitra on it. Mm-hmm. As it was the Healing Justice podcast, they do an offer and then they do a practice to follow up on that. And so it's a 30-minute practice, something less than that, but it's basically the core practice of somatics, which is just centering, learning how to actually drop into your body and feel and center in real time. And the idea is that you don't center to feel calm or better, you center to feel more.
Yeah.
That if you can feel more,
what is,
feel what is and feel more of it, then you start to have actual agency in real time over the choices you make, over the connections you move towards, over the connections you can start to set real boundaries around. Like, I can feel when someone is not a good energy to have around me, right? That doesn't mean they don't deserve to have people around them, but it's not going to happen here, right?
Right.
I'm going to move towards those people who are like the right energy for me, for me growing them and for them growing me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to offer that because when it comes to healing, I think it helps to be fairly tangible. Like there's some, I feel like that for me, like I went to talk therapy for, a decade or whatever. Right. And I've been able to move so much more through being able to feel, because I feel like talk therapy, I was still able to stay in my head and tell my stories and tell my lies and you can do it. If your therapist starts to be on to you, you just move on to a next one. Like, here's my story, right? Or whatever it is. And I just think there's something so beautiful about dropping in and being like, I'm in a community of people who hold me accountable to being able to feel myself. And even now, like, I've been touring this book. I land in a new city and I run into someone who's also a somatic practitioner, and they hold me and they're like, are you good? Are you centering? Are you good? How are you feeling? And I know that they really care and they want to know.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I can feel the connection and my aliveness just expand.
So important.
Yeah.
Adrienne Maree Brown, thank you so much for your words today, for joining us. I know we could talk for easy another hour probably, but you don't have the time. At least not today. Hopefully we can chat again at some point. That would be special.
Yay. Thank you so much for having me on, Neil. I really appreciate being a guest on the show, and I hope it's of use to people.
It is my pleasure, and I just want to encourage everyone who's listening to check out all your work, but especially your latest book, Pleasure Activism, Emergent Strategy. They're both written with such care, and I really felt them speaking to me in my unfolding, and I know it would be a gift to any reader who's here with us. And it feels like a fun footnote that the friend that I met who introduced me to you and your work, we were actually both attending a somatic experiencing workshop with Peter Levine.
Yay!
So,
awesome.
So I love how it came back into somatics here at the end. So important to find that truth of who you are and your experience in your body in this moment. And so much aliveness comes from there.
Thank you, Neil.
Adrienne, if people want to find out more about your work, what can they do?
They can go to the website, alliedmedia.org/ESII. That's where you can get like trainings, workshops, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then I'm on Instagram at Adrienne Maree Brown. And that's where I mostly post things into the world.
Great. Well, we will make sure there are links in all our stuff. And thank you so much for being with us today and with me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Take care, Adrienne. And just as a reminder, if you want a detailed transcript of today's episode, you can get that by visiting neilsattin.com/AMB, as in Adrienne Maree Brown, or you can text the word passion to the number 33444 and follow the instructions. And we will have links to everything that we mentioned here in today's episode, as well as to the Healing Justice, I think is what Adrienne said, the Healing Justice podcast episode that she mentioned as a gift for you. All right, take care.